Hello everyone, my name is Julia Tymoshenko and you're watching How Come? An interview series where we look closely at ideas, events, and forces that shape how the world moves forward. In this episode, we talk to Marci Shore, a historian of Eastern Europe and a chair in European intellectual history at the University of Toronto, who has written and spoken extensively about Ukraine, memory, revolution, and moral responsibility. So, Professor Shore, thank you so much for coming to our talk today. I want to talk about something that you actually deeply interested in and something that you worked on for a while. Your work on Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity and the book that you put out called The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution looks at revolutions and these kinds of events as not just, a geopolitical big act, but also a very personal event that changes people, how they think, their identity. And when we look at these events in the Middle East or Venezuela and how the United States or some actors within the United States have tried to market it under a pro-democratic regime change or a change that would bring like democracy to those countries. Something that I'm curious, going back to your work, is that are these, in your opinion, external installments of governments or regime changes actually meant to be even successful if they're not prompting any change or personal experience within the lives of those people? Can those, even if, I don't know, a democratic government is installed with the help of the United States, like it happened before, is there hope that it even can take the root, given that the people themselves have not lived through the experience of going through that change?
Oh, it's a good question. And again, I'm not an expert on this topic either. But in the case of Venezuela, I don't think that Trump did not even pretend, that this was, in the interest of democracy. I mean, he made it quite clear it was about oil, and what he wanted was Venezuelan oil. And then he also wanted a photo op of himself in a Wikipedia page as acting president of Venezuela, because he's almost a self-parody of this Nero-like narcissism. And clearly this kind of operation to take out, so I have no sympathy for Maduro either. It's not clear that, there's been any real democratic change in Venezuela or that the people left in power are going to actually carry out any kind of democratic reforms. But clearly, I mean, there's a question of if foreign intervention can ever help, even in the best circumstances, and if so, how? And that's one question. And then there's another question of, in the case of the Trump administration in particular, is there even any intention to help anyone apart from himself? And I think the answer to that is no. One can argue about, are there scenarios, in which some kind of support from the United States or some democratic country that has, good interest and good faith, could that be helpful? 2 weeks ago, Khomeini and his regime were just massacring Iranians in the streets, and we didn't do anything to save those people then. I'm not sure that, who we might be saving now, but we don't really, Trump doesn't really care about those people. So this is a particular case. I mean, in 2014, when I was watching the Russian propaganda say that the revolution on the Maidan was a CIA-sponsored conspiracy, and these were, American-backed Ukrainian Nazis who had an intention of marching east to massacre all the Russian speakers. And among the many things, that were, one, it was lie, but among the many things that were painful about that story was that I know that my friends who were on the Maidan, who were ready to give their lives for this revolution, not only did they know perfectly well that this was not an American operation, but they were desperately hoping for more international support and more international solidarity. And our support was very vague. I mean, I think the American ambassador who was there at the time was genuinely very involved and sympathetic. I think people who were on the ground and knew Ukraine did feel a personal commitment and a personal connection. Obama, who, in general, I have a tremendous amount of respect for, his attention was elsewhere. He wasn't that focused on Ukraine at all. I was in Vienna at the time. I was in Austria that year. And, for most of the Europeans and certainly the German-speaking world, there was sympathy, but not very much engagement. I remember an article in Der Falter at the time that was a very sympathetic article that said something about the kids in Kiev. And my friend, my very, very sadly no longer with us friend, Martin Polak, who was one of the great Austrian Slavicist and writers. Nelia Wachovska, by the way, translated his book about his father into Ukrainian, and everybody should read that. It should be required reading in all Ukrainian schools. But I remember Martin, who was also watching the Maidan very carefully, he was just enraged by the kids in Kiev, and he wrote back, he said, the kids in Kiev, do you see that these people are being tortured? Do you see like the kids in Kiev was supportive, but it was condescending, so not condemning, but condescending. And that was my general feeling too, that, the world's attention was elsewhere, and it's not that people weren't sympathetic, but they weren't that involved and they didn't see it as that important. And it was all self-organization. And the Maidan was a revelation, of the potential for self-organization. And that was one of the things that really excited me, to see what civil society, which was something we had talked about when we were trying to understand dissident activity in the 70s and 80s and then forgotten about, and then to see what civil society could do, this latent potential that people hadn't suspected. What does spontaneity mean? What does self-organization mean? What does it mean for a critical mass of people to cross to the other side of fear? The miracle of revolution is that you need enough people who are willing to cross to the other side of fear at the same time. And that ever happens, it is a miracle.
Wow, that's, I think, a very powerful description of revolutions. But yeah, going back to that story that you said, that how, back then Russian propaganda was working over time to convince people around the world that this is a CIA coup and, America is behind it. I think what I'm personally struggling sometimes when talking to a lot of my friends, especially from abroad, who consider United States to be this kind of neo-colonial power that intervenes in their own self-interest in these conflicts around the world and sparks these conflicts around the world, that it's been obviously even more difficult to argue that Ukraine, by asking the United States to support us, to help us, to become our ally, is not like, trying to support the other acts that the United States might have done or is doing otherwise, but we don't have rather a choice and we need to find an ally there. But I think for some people, it's black and white. It's either you support this neo-colonialism or not, but a lot of those people very often forget to talk about Russia's neo-colonial acts today. What do you respond to those people who want to have such a clear-cut picture of everything and say that, well, because United States has self-interest in Ukraine as well, then Ukrainian war is also this proxy war between Russia and the US, essentially?
No, I think what you're getting at is the opposition to more involvement in aid to Ukraine on the part of the left, the American left and the far left, the American far left and the international far left. And that, of course, has been painful to me because I consider myself a person on the left. I mean, that's not, maybe my primary identification, but I've always been a person, let's say left of center. And I think that in essence, at least I can speak to the American case. It's a very self-absorbed way of looking at the situation because essentially it's saying that this is all about us. This is all about American identity. The United States as a country has done many despicable things. If you watch one of these documentaries on Henry Kissinger, you'll see that we intervened in various places during the Cold War, not necessarily in good faith and at tremendous cost to human life, and often in self-interest. The United States has certainly done all sorts of nasty imperial things. But the argument that because we have done nasty imperial things and nasty imperialistic things, and we should be self-critical, therefore we should be indulgent, of Putin's neo-totalitarianism, launching nasty imperialist wars, that to me doesn't make any logical sense. That to me is a way of taking self-criticism to the point of just kind of self-absorption. That because it's all about our trying to understand ourselves and being critical about ourselves, therefore, whoever is against us we have to be sympathetic to because we want to be critical about our having done bad things. I'm very sympathetic to the fact that Americans should be self-critical. Starting with domestic politics. Arguably the first thing we should be thinking about, is American racism, and American violence. And the fact that we had miscegenation laws prohibiting interracial marriage in various states until 1967, 5 years before I was born, and the fact that Black Americans are regularly subject to police violence and arbitrary violence. We have a lot of reason for there to be self-criticism. I don't see the reason that any of that should lead to we should be indulgent to some other 21st century dictator, launching an invasion and carrying out mass atrocities on another country. Like there's no logical, I don't see any logical connection. The fact that we have done bad things does not mean everyone should be excused from doing bad things. If one had to be perfect in order to make any kind of moral argument about the world, we would all be silenced. So I'm not very sympathetic to that argument at all. I understand more a kind of knee-jerk reluctance to say like, okay, so many cases of American involvement have resulted in causing other people suffering. So the safe thing is for there to be no involvement and we shouldn't be involved anywhere at all. And therefore we shouldn't be helping Ukraine. I mean, and that is a more understandable argument. And I think that requires a much more nuanced response. And it's an argument I can understand if I were a little bit further away, because the world is big and complicated, and there are horrible things happening to people all over the world every day about which I know very little, if not nothing. And it's not that I think that, the lives of people in Sudan are worth less than the lives of people in Ukraine, or the lives of people in Gaza are worth less. Or, I'm very engaged in Ukraine because this is a part of the world that I know. It's a part of the world I know, not because I study war or meant to study war, but because I was trained as a historian of Eastern Europe. And so when this war broke out, starting in 2014, these are my friends and colleagues. These are places and people I know. And in some way, the world is always divided into people you know personally and people you don't know personally. And when you have a more intimate connection, you understand better, and so I feel like I do understand things about this war that other people don't because I'm closer to it, and so it's easier for me to say that I do think we should intervene, that I think NATO should intervene. Now, because I feel it more. I also think it's historically a very unusual situation and its moral clarity. Not because Ukraine is a perfect country. I never thought Ukraine was a perfect country. I understood very well that Ukraine was a country struggling to rid itself of kleptocratic oligarchy, a country struggling with corruption, a country still struggling to confront, histories of collaboration, of pogroms, of racism, of anti-Semitism, of violence. Like I understood all of that. But none of Ukraine's imperfections possibly justified, Russia, for absolutely no reason, launching a full-scale invasion and suddenly crossing a border and just carrying out mass murder and mass torture of people. That there was no possible pretext for that. And it's unusual in its moral clarity that there was absolutely no real reason for this war. I mean, all of the reasons were fictitious. Putin says, oh, we have to defend the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. Oh, we have to restore the lands of Peter the Great. Oh, there was a CIA-sponsored Nazi cabal, installed in Kiev. Oh, NATO was plotting an attack on Russia. Therefore, we have to have a preemptive attack. I mean, he pulls something new out of the hat every day. None of that is a real reason. That we're just watching people being massacred, and kids being buried under rubble, day after day after day for nothing, for no conceivable pretext. And that's historically unusual. Like, that kind of moral clarity is historically unusual. There's just absolutely no excuse. There was this horrifically nihilistic moment in Mstislav Chernov's brilliant film 2,000 Meters to Andriivka, where if your viewers have probably seen it, but the moment at the end when you've been embedded with Chernov, with this Ukrainian unit, and they're losing one person after another in this tragic attempt to recapture Andriivka, and the Russians are shooting and they keep killing them, and they take this one Russian soldier who surrenders, prisoner of war, and they give the guy water and start talking to him. And the young commander is saying, like, hey, you think this was my dream, to be here at my age at 19, out here in the woods fighting with you? Why did you come here? What are you doing here? And the Russian soldier they captured, he's like, я не знаю, почему я здесь. And he's like, I don't know why I'm here. And you realize at that moment that he's telling the truth. He doesn't know. And all of this death and hell and destruction, like, for nothing, that Russia has launched this war for nothing, for some, perverted fantasy going on inside one man's head. And that combined with the fact that I'm a historian of 20th century totalitarianism, and I see where this could go, from the very beginning in 2014, the first moments of the illegal annexation of Crimea, which felt a lot like the Anschluss to me. Yeah, it felt a lot like 1938, and Nazi Germany taking over Austria, and then this instigation of the war in the Donbass. And I kept hearing, as a historian in 2014, I kept hearing in my mind Neville Chamberlain go back to London after the Munich conference, and say to the British people, how horrible it would be if we were digging trenches and trying on gas masks on behalf of a quarrel in a faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. And I thought, wow, the Donbass is going to be that quarrel in a faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. That's going to be the beginning of the Third World War. So I also, I never really felt like Putin would stop. I mean, I felt like we allowed this, we can call it neo-fascist or neo-totalitarian or postmodern fascist or whatever we want to call it. We've let this thing grow. We failed to cut it off, and I don't see any, any way we come out on the other side until the Russian regime is completely, utterly brought down, totally defeated. I don't think we're in a negotiation situation. I don't think in 1943 we could have been negotiating with Hitler in such a way that some part of Europe remained under Nazi occupation. I don't think that was viable. And I think that's the situation we're in now. And so I think there should be more American involvement. I think there should be more European involvement. I think America is the United States is a lost cause at the moment. This regime cannot be trusted. I think the Europeans have to step up. But I do think there should be involvement. And I feel strongly about that because this happens to be a case I know, and I do think it's historically a relatively unusual case. I'm sorry, that was a long answer to that question.
No, thank you so much for giving such a good perspective on how you came to understand this war also from your scholarship and your studies. Across the world today, and also here in Ukraine, some people say that Trump's actions in Venezuela and in Iran send a very strong message to dictators of the world. And some people hope that they will also send a message to Putin. And I think that's something that President Zelensky also hinted in his statement on recent events. But I wonder if that's actually true, or is the fact how Trump is actually doing it, what he's doing, and his own, I don't know, like allergy to justice as such, does it actually send that strong message to dictators, or that, you know, they will get justice for their wrongdoings, or is it actually emboldening them in some way?
I mean, I would like to think, that this sends some kind of message to Putin, but I unfortunately have almost no hope of that whatsoever. For whatever reason, Trump has long been in Putin's pocket. And we can speculate about why. We can speculate about whether there's compromise or whether it's just some kind of affinity that one gangster style dictator has for another gangster style dictator, or whether it's a debt owed from assistance in the 2016 elections. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, Trump has long been in Putin's pocket. And I don't see much hope of that changing. I say this is a politics of gangsters. This is the politics of the mob. This is really what Hannah Arendt describes in the third part of Origins of Totalitarianism, where she talks about Nazism, as the politics of the mob mobilizing the masses. Trump's politics is the politics of the mob. Everything is transactional. I mean, this is all criminals and gangsters. One of the most insightful and, terrifying moments before most Americans, including myself, really thought that Trump would come to power happened in, I think it was early, maybe summer of 2016. And there was an article published by the American journalist Frank Foer. And Frank was someone I had actually met in Kiev in 2014. And he's not a specialist in Eastern Europe, but he was someone who was very carefully watching the Maidan and publishing quite a lot about it at the time as an editor. And he came to Kiev, and one of the things he was interested in was figuring out how Yanukovych came back to power, how he stayed in power. And he followed this story of Paul Manafort. When Yanukovych is coming back to power, which people of my generation, Ukraine, all know. I'm not sure how much the younger generation followed this, but after 2004, I mean, it just seemed, at least from the outside, it was totally impossible that he could ever come back. Yeah. But then it turns out that in the United States, we have a little boutique industry with PR specialists for gangsters with presidential ambitions. And so Yanukovych is able to hire this guy from Washington who doesn't speak Ukrainian, doesn't speak Russian, but knows how to play golf, and has expensive taste in wine, and flies over to Kiev and dresses him up in new suits and gives him some telegenic hints and eats caviar with him, and gives him a makeover. I mean, personally, he still seemed like a gangster to me. I don't really understand the appeal of the makeover, but somehow this was effective, and then of course, after the sniper massacre on the Maidan, Yanukovych flees across the border to Russia. You all know this. Paul Manafort, the PR guy, is out of a job. And we know what he does next. He comes back home and he goes to work getting Donald Trump elected. And Frank Foer wrote this article before any of us really thought that this nightmarish thing that had suddenly appeared on the American political stage could actually come true. And I can't remember offhand the title of the article, but the headline was something like, "You don't think Trump can win, but you don't know Paul Manafort." And Frank was right. And I read that and thought, that scared me, because I thought he's right and he does understand something about what's going on. And one of the things that kind of what terrified me at the time and continues to terrify me 10 years later is that I was an early panicker. I was very nervous about Trump, I would say, by the end of September 2015. But not because I was smarter than the rest of my American friends and colleagues, but because I had been watching Russia and Ukraine. And I felt like there were things that Trump was picking up, let's say, from Putin. Certain things about post-truth, about this kind of shameless lying that, as a Slavicist, I would call kind of obnaženia, and the anthropologist Natalia Rudakova described as cynical disinhibition, where you just shamelessly throw out the cruelty and the ugliness as a matter of public display. And because I saw it, working, if we're going to call it working in Russia, I got scared sooner than most Americans. And then when I read Frank's piece about Paul Manafort operating behind the scenes, I was still more scared. I'm sorry, I forgot what our original question was. I somehow got off on this Paul Manafort track.
No. It was about sending a message to dictators and whether Trump is actually maybe even emboldening some of them. And I mean, I think the story about Putin and the direct connection between Paul Manafort and the mob in Ukraine is really illustrative to how Trump is actually connected with a lot of those people. I wonder, because you were saying how you have been this early panicker, and at the same time there were a lot of people that were saying before Trump 1.0 and before Trump 2.0 as well that let's not panic. We have these very strong institutions inside the United States of America, and it seemed like in his first term those institutions, or the people that stood behind those institutions, actually managed to somehow preserve that independence and preserve democratic systems inside the country. But something really dramatically shifted in his second term, and we see that a lot of institutions and people leading them, they kneeled very quickly, and they helped those spaces, organizations get dissolved really, really quickly as well. I wonder, how do you explain yourself what has happened and why that prediction that, those checks and balances would hold Trump have not really came true?
I was never that confident in the checks and balances. But perhaps that's because I'm the kind of historian. I work on intellectual history, so I write a lot about philosophy and literature, and a lot of it is about individuals. I'm not really a historian of institutions, and I think I've always been a little bit skeptical about institutions. And from my perspective, the institutions are only as strong as the individual people who are working in them. So if you purge enough people, if you fire them, if you intimidate them, if you buy them off, if you chase them away, these are not institutions that work on their own. They're depending on integrity, and you're depending on people to take risk, and they can be dismantled, and loopholes can be exploited. They're not a kind of magical pill. I mean, Americans had this, I think, delusion that we have some kind of genetic immunity to fascism. I don't believe in genetic immunity. I don't believe in it on the part of Americans, on the part of Ukrainians, Jews, Poles, Russians. I'm very much an Arendtian in this sense, and so much of Arendt's, debate with, other historians and theorists of Nazism was about what was particular to Germans versus what is universal, and she was very concerned with the universal. And I'm kind of hardwired in some sense as a universalist. I feel like these are what leads us to tyranny, what leads us to, we can call it fascism, neo-fascism, various kinds of totalitarianism. These are the exploitation of vulnerabilities that are inherent in the human condition. Nobody gets some kind of magical immunity. We did have better institutions than some other places, but that doesn't mean that they're perfect and are going to hold up, and over time they can be taken down. I mean, there were various moments like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death during, her death during the first Trump administration, which was tragic on so many levels. Obama had wanted her to retire at a time when he could have nominated her replacement. The fact that she didn't retire, that she was determined to work, and then she died, and she died during Trump's administration, and therefore he got to nominate that. The fact that he was able to stack the Supreme Court with his own appointees, that was deadly. The 2024 Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity was deadly. So individuals are playing a role here. The Supreme Court is supposed to be your last defense, and that breaks down on us. Our institutions had been eroding arguably at least since the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which essentially created structures by which anyone could donate as much money as they wanted to political campaigns. And that, in effect, created a situation where political campaigns could be bought. I kept one of the words I tried to introduce into American political discourse in the first Trump administration was prodajnost. We don't have that word, but we have the phenomenon. I mean, the closest English would be venality, but that has kind of more of a kind of Victorian tone to it, but this idea of saleability. So corruption, not just as an instance or a specific case of corruption, but the idea that people themselves can be bought or sold or are willing to be bought or sold. And Trump operates on this principle, and it's the principle of gangsters, and that became more and more open. The idea, and he lives in this world in which there are no real relationships. Everything is transactional.
I mean, we can see it with the recently created Board of Peace.
Yes.
She said, pay me, what is it, $1 billion? Million seems like too little. Yeah. And then I'll let you in this club of people that, that I will treat a little bit better, just a little bit better than everybody else.
And that's an excellent example. And that's obnażenie, right? That's laying bare. That's what Natalia would call cynical disinhibition. You're not hiding the fact that you can be bought and sold. You're not hiding the fact that it's all transactional. Right. Like, yes, come to my private club and I'll or Carney, we're throwing you out of your club, out of this club, no matter how much money you paid because you criticized me. Or I'm going to have a fancy dinner party for people who buy my cryptocurrency, or I'm like, it's all right in your face. It's so obvious that it disempowered the opposition during the first Trump administration, because people kept waiting for the thing that was hidden to be revealed that would then shock people into bringing it all down. But the problem wasn't what was hidden. The problem was what we had normalized. And you start normalizing these things step by step by step, until people just get used to accepting the situation. And that's what happened.
So I have kind of like two questions. Like, how do you then get out of this sort of like vicious circle where he does something crazy and, people normalize it, and then he does something even crazier? Because you've said that for a lot of Americans, for a lot of people watching from outside, the Supreme Court was supposed to be that last defense, something that's stopping this. And it wasn't. So what can be that last defense line?
No, it's a really good question. I mean, now everybody is waiting and hoping that the midterm elections that could change the balance of power in both halves of Congress actually occur, which they may or may not actually occur because it's clear Trump doesn't want them to happen. Technically speaking, if they occur, if they're held legally, if they're held fairly, if the Democrats do take power in both houses of Congress, which is unlikely but not impossible, they could impeach. It's very hard to impeach. As you know, there were 2 impeachment trials during the first Trump administration. And immediately afterwards, one, provoked by Trump's phone call with Zelensky, the infamous phone call with Zelensky. And in both cases, the House of Representatives, which were dominated by Democrats at the time, did vote to impeach, but it was not confirmed by the Senate. If it were to be confirmed by the Senate, which requires a very large vote, I think it's more than just a bare majority, then he could be removed from power. How realistic that is, I don't know. I mean, what happened in Minnesota was both terrifying and heartbreaking, but also very inspiring. We watched, again, like right in front of our face. I mean, it made me think of that moment early in Putinism where that submarine was sinking, the Russian submarine was sinking in Russia, and those Russian the Russian officers or soldiers or, submarine workers were suffocating in the bottom of the sea, and various other countries offered to send rescue divers. And Putin just had no interest. He didn't care. He didn't want anyone else he didn't want to let anyone else in. And everyone knew that those men were suffocating at the bottom of the sea. It's not that people didn't know what was happening while it was happening. And Putin just very smugly just kind of looks at everyone with his smile like, this is what I'm going to do. And it made me think of that when I watched Minnesota, and you watch these siloviki, which is another word we don't have, but we need, these like guys in masks, in broad daylight on a residential street, fire 3 bullets into the head of a 37-year-old mother who has just dropped her 6-year-old off at school, who was not threatening anybody, who was legally documenting an ICE raid, which is something any one of the neighbors on my street in New Haven would have come out to do. I could easily imagine that could have been any one of us. We watched him fire 3 bullets into her head, killing this woman instantly with absolute impunity, and then we watch, Kirsty Noem and the Department of Homeland Security, and the head of ICE and the president of the United States get on television and lie about it, and justify a murder that we all just watched happening right in front of our eyes, and in a way that's just absolutely chilling, and the good, there's nothing good about that, but is that, Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, was very good and didn't compromise. And the people in Minnesota did come out into the streets, including people who had never come out into the streets before, who were not politically active, but it did shock people, into mobilizing. And then they killed a second person, and people were out on the streets, even though there was clearly a risk of being killed, and that's a very hard thing to ask of people. This is why revolution is so hard. And this is why you run into the class of collective action problems. And this is why we've all been tearing our hair out about why we can never get a revolution in Russia. I remember still in 2022, I think I was talking to a Ukrainian colleague who was in the States. And I said, Vlad, what would it take, to bring down Putin's regime? And he said, Marci, 2 million people in the streets of Moscow, it's over tomorrow. I said, how do you know it's 2 million? Is 1.9 million not enough? When is it that one additional person? But everyone individually acting rationally has a reason to say it's too risky. They could kill me, which they could. Therefore, I'm going to stay home. 500 people.
Somehow we see people in Iran and in other tyrannical countries under tyrannical regimes still risking their lives. And we've seen those women. And for some reason, we have failed to see that the same happening in Russia. No. So I think it's not only about the number, it's even about the, even about the perception, whether something is going on or not. And it's really hard to say whether in Russia it is going on.
You need a lot of people willing to be very brave at the same time. And that's extraordinary. Like, I don't know that I would be. I don't know that I would want my children out there. But I also know that it's the only way. This is how the Maidan won, in some sense. There was a moment, you would know better than I do because you're the one in Ukraine, but even watching from a distance, it seemed to me that November 21st, 22nd, none of those young people or not young people out on the Maidan are thinking, I'm going to die here. People are listening to music. People are holding hands. People are saying Ukraine is Europe. By the second half of January, even from a distance, you could feel almost palpably that a critical mass of people had made a decision that they were willing to die there if need be. And that was an extraordinary thing to watch. Like, you can only watch that with awe. And how that happens historically, what pushes people to that place, where it comes from, that's part of the miracle of revolution.
Yeah. So in short, I know that we don't have a lot of time, but what do you think is lacking in Russia for that miracle to happen?
This is an excellent question. The most interesting thing I've read, I've been tearing my hair out about this. as have so many of us. Like, what went wrong in Russia? What is the source of the pathology, of the anthropological catastrophe? I don't believe it's genetic. And there are too many, I don't believe in genetic explanations. And there are too many divided families, on both sides of the Russian-Ukrainian border. So how do you explain that? How do you explain that there are people being, Ukrainian soldiers being taken captive, whose immediate Russian family members on the other side of the border are believing that they've done something horrible? Like, this is clearly not genetic. There's clearly something going on culturally, socially, politically, that is forming these things. There was a very interesting study that was done recently by a friend of mine in Vienna named Marci Shore, who is my generation, born in the 70s, grew up in Soviet Kiev, then did a first degree in Petersburg, and then moved to Germany and did a doctorate in Germany, and has been working in the German-speaking world for a long time. And she had been doing sociological research, sociologist. She had been doing sociological research still in Russia, doing interviews until several years ago when it was no longer safe for her to go back. But she and a colleague at the Sigmund Freud University in Vienna recently did this study analyzing thousands of essays written by teenagers, high school kids, Russian teenagers, high school kids, adolescents, in response to a prompt that Memorial had originally given to do research about victims of Stalinist repression in your family, in your community, in your school, in your town, to kind of encourage students to learn something, about the past. And the really interesting finding that they came up with was that the problem wasn't that these Russian adolescents had no empathy for the victims of Stalinist terror. Anna found reading the essays that, in fact, they had a lot of empathy for the victims and a sense of the subjectivity of the victims, a sense that these were real people who really suffered. But they had no sense of the subjectivity of the perpetrators. That somehow all of the victims were people. You could write about them, in the personal form, but all constructions about perpetrators were in the realm of the impersonal, as if Stalinist terror was this metaphysical act of nature, some kind of tsunami, that no individual person was actually responsible for, and certainly couldn't be controlled, or stopped by individual people. And I thought that was a fascinating finding, that the problem wasn't a failure to recognize the subjectivity of the victims. The problem was a failure to recognize the subjectivity of the perpetrators. And my gut inclination, and again, I haven't been in Russia in 10 years now, so I'm, I don't have, like all of us who can't go to Russia anymore, like, we only have access from a distance. But that there's something about this crisis of subjectivity. I mean, I remember Anna coming back from research after the Maidan that she had done in Russia. And one of the questions she was asking people was, how can something like Stalinist terror be prevented from happening again? And when she got back to Vienna, she said, Marci, not only did they not have an answer, they didn't understand the question. Said Stalinist terror was like, she used the phrase in German, which we don't have in English, Naturgewalt. It was like a violent act of nature. Like, you can't stop an earthquake. You can't stop the rain from coming. Best case scenario, you have an umbrella in the closet, but there's nothing that can be done about it. And Tanya Ogarkova and Volodya Malenko wrote a piece for an English language journal in Ireland, Irish Pages, a year or so ago, called Crime Without Punishment and Punishment Without Crime. And they said that there are two kinds of people in Russia. There are these untouchable Übermenschen, these oligarchs, these gangsters who can commit any horrible crime with absolute impunity and are never accountable. And then there are these masses of ordinary people who can be punished for anything at any time, regardless of whether or not it's real or they've done anything, who are just kind of at the mercy of proizvol, at this kind of arbitrariness of the powers that be. And in both of those cases, you have a crisis of subjectivity. In both of those cases, there is no responsible agent taking responsibility for specific actions. And my sense is that this is at the root of something that's gone very, very wrong in Russia. Now, how we fix this, like, I think we need a kind of Stunde Null. I think that regime has to totally, utterly fall. There has to be a total reset. I mean, a lot of my colleagues, including in the Russian opposition, think the country has to be broken up. It's too big, that the scale of it doesn't work, that you need a smaller scale in order for there to be any hope of any kind of real democratic participation. I have no expertise on that, but clearly something needs to be radically, radically different.
Well, I'm really sad that we don't have more time to dive into this, but I think that was such a good insight into the topic of, that question of why there is no real action currently happening in Russia. Well, we can see that action taking place in the most, tyrannical countries around the world. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, and we hope to see you maybe in person in our studio once you come to Kyiv. We would really love to have a longer conversation about a lot of these things, because I wanted to dive into Iran and other subjects, but I'm really grateful that you gave us this hour today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And yes, let's talk about Arendt when I'm in Kiev. I will look forward to it.
This interview will be available at the Ukrainian English YouTube channel, so please don't miss it.